Somewhere in the Carolina Lowcountry, buried beneath layers of family Bibles and burned correspondence, lies evidence of a transaction that violated every law of God and man. A woman who couldn't bear children found the solution that the planter class would have called ingenious, and that history would call monstrous. For 12 years, a child lived in a grand house on the Ashley River, never knowing that the woman who raised him shared no blood with him at all. The truth was hidden in plain sight, protected by a conspiracy that reached from the parlor to the quarters, enforced by fear, and maintained through silence. What drove a respectable Charleston matron to orchestrate such a deception? The answer lies in letters that were never meant to survive, in the testimony of those who finally broke their silence, and in a revelation that tore apart one of South Carolina's most prominent families. Before we continue with the story of the Rootwood Plantation and the woman who built her legacy on a lie, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss our darkest historical mysteries. And in the comments, tell us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our community of history lovers is watching from. Now let's uncover what really happened along the Ashley River in the years before the war. The Rootwood Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Carolina bottomland, its fields producing some of the finest Sea Island cotton that ever reached the Charleston market. The main house stood at the end of an oak-lined drive, a white column testament to wealth accumulated over 3 generations. In 1843, the plantation was home to Nathaniel Rootwood, 37 years old, and his wife Catherine, 32, a couple whose marriage had become the subject of increasingly uncomfortable whispers among Charleston society. Nathaniel had inherited the property from his father in 1838, along with the labor of 143 enslaved people whose worth exceeded the value of the land itself. He was known as a progressive planter, one who read agricultural journals and experimented with crop rotation. He treated his slaves no worse than his neighbors did, which is to say, he treated them as valuable livestock, their health and productivity matters of financial calculation rather than moral concern. Catherine had come from a prominent Savannah family, the Hammonds, whose fortune rested on rice and naval stores. When she married Nathaniel in 1836, she brought a dowry of $20,000 and the expectation that she would quickly produce the heirs required to secure the family's future. But 7 years had passed without a pregnancy, and in a world where a woman's worth was measured primarily by her fertility, Catherine's position grew more precarious with each passing season. The couple had consulted physicians in Charleston, Savannah, and even as far away as Philadelphia. Catherine had endured treatments that ranged from the merely uncomfortable to the genuinely dangerous mercury compounds, lead-based tonics, bleedings, and internal manipulations that left her bedridden for days. Nothing worked. The diagnosis, delivered with the brutal frankness common to medical men of that era, was that Catherine's womb was inhospitable to the generative process. In simpler terms, she would never bear children. For Nathaniel, this presented a problem both practical and social. Without legitimate heirs, the plantation would pass to his younger brother's children, a prospect he found intolerable. For Catherine, the stakes were even higher. A barren wife could be set aside, her property returning to her family while she lived out her days in diminished circumstances, pied by the very society that had once celebrated her beauty and accomplishments. It was Catherine who first conceived the solution, though she would later claim the idea came to her in a dream sent by Providence itself. The spring of 1844 brought unusual heat to the Lowcountry. Snorts, the kind of oppressive warmth that made even the lightest clothing feel like a burden. Catherine spent most of her days on the second floor veranda, where she could catch whatever breeze drifted in from the river. From this vantage point, she could see the entire sweep of the plantation, the cotton fields stretching toward the treeing, the collection of whitewashed cabins that housed the slave quarters, the brick buildings that held the cotton press and the carpentry shop. It was from this vere that Catherine began to truly study the enslaved women who worked in her house. She observed them with a new kind of attention, noting their ages, their builds, their features. She paid particular notice to a young woman named Delilah, who had been brought up to the main house 2 years earlier to train as a lady's maid. Delilah was 22 years old, the daughter of the plantation's most skilled cooper, and a woman who had died of fever 5 years prior. She was literate, taught to read and write by a previous owner who had been censured by his neighbors for his dangerous liberality, and possessed what the family called refined features. More importantly, Delilah was light-skinned, the product of generations of forced mixture that had left her with features that could, with the right clothing and context, pass for white in dimmer light. Catherine began to treat Delilah with unusual attention. She kept her close, training her personally in the intricate tasks of a lady's maid, dressing hair, selecting clothing, managing correspondence. She spoke to her in tones that the other house slaves found unsettling, addressing her almost as an equal in private moments, and she began to ask questions about Delilah's monthly cycles, her health, her family history. Questions that made Delilah deeply uncomfortable, but which she dared not refuse to answer. By summer, Catherine's plan had taken full shape in her mind. She would have Nathaniel father a child on Delilah, then claim that child as her own. It was not unprecedented. Slave women bore their masters' children constantly, and the resulting mixed-race offspring were simply absorbed into the slave population. But Catherine's scheme went far beyond the casual rape that characterized plantation life. She intended to take the child, to raise it as white, to present it to Charleston society as the legitimate heir to the Routledge fortune. The logistics were complex, but Catherine had always possessed a talent for organization. She began to complain of mysterious female ailments that required privacy and rest. She ordered the construction of a small cottage on the far edge of the property, claiming she needed a retreat for her recovery. She sent away the older house slaves, replacing them with younger women who could be more easily controlled through fear and promises. And then, on a sweltering night in August, Catherine explained her plan to Nathaniel. The conversation took place in Nathaniel's study, a room lined with law books and agricultural journals, illuminated by the soft glow of whale oil lamps. Catherine had prepared her arguments carefully, framing the scheme not as a moral transgression, but as a practical solution to an impossible problem. She reminded Nathaniel of what they stood to lose if they remained childless. She painted vivid pictures of his brother's children inheriting everything he had worked to improve and expand. She appealed to his vanity, his pride, his deep-seated belief that he deserved to found a dynasty. Nathaniel's initial response was shock, then revulsion, then, as Catherine continued to speak, a kind of horrified fascination. He understood immediately what she was proposing and what it would mean. The moral implications troubled him far less than the practical challenges. How could they convince society that Catherine had borne a child when dozens of people knew she had not been pregnant? How could they ensure the silence of everyone who would inevitably learn the truth? Catherine had answers for every objection. They would stage a pregnancy complete with clothing that suggested a growing belly. They would claim Catherine needed rest and seclusion during her delicate condition, limiting visitors to the plantation. They would have the birth take place in the cottage she had built, attended only by those they could control through threats or promises. They would return to Charleston society months later with a healthy infant, its features ambiguous enough that no one would question its parentage. As for ensuring silence, Catherine had given this considerable thought as well. The slaves who knew the truth would be bound by their very powerlessness. What slave could accuse their master's wife of such a scheme without facing immediate and terrible punishment? Any white person who learned the secret would be complicit in its maintenance, bound by the same social codes that protected all of the planter class's transgressions, and the child itself would never know, raised from infancy to believe Catherine was its mother and Nathaniel its father. The conversation lasted until dawn. By the time the sun rose over the Ashley River, Nathaniel had agreed to every detail of his wife's plan. The implementation began that very week. Catherine announced to the household that she was once again expecting that the Philadelphia physician's treatments had finally proven successful. She made a great show of her delicate condition, retiring early from dinners, canceling social engagements, spending long hours in her room with only Delilah in attendance. Delilah, meanwhile, had been moved into a small room adjacent to Catherine's suite, close enough to be constantly available, but isolated from the other slaves. She was told that she would be carrying a child for the mistress, that this was a great honor, that her cooperation would result in special treatment for herself and her father. The alternative was never explicitly stated, but hung in the air like the threat of an approaching storm. What followed over the next several months was a grotesque pantomime of pregnancy. Catherine padded her clothing to simulate a growing belly, while Delilah's actual condition was hidden beneath loose-fitting dresses. The young enslaved woman was forbidden from leaving the main house, kept isolated from even her own father. She was fed a rich diet meant to ensure the health of the child she carried, while Catherine maintained her own elegant figure through careful corseting beneath the padding. Nathaniel fulfilled his role with grim efficiency, visiting Delilah on 3 consecutive nights in September until Catherine deemed it sufficient. He never spoke to her beyond her instructions, never acknowledged what he was doing beyond the physical act itself. To admit the reality would be to confront the full horror of the arrangement, and Nathaniel had spent his entire life perfecting the art of not seeing what was inconvenient to acknowledge. By December, Delilah's pregnancy was unmistakable to anyone who might have seen her, but Catherine had ensured that no one beyond a carefully controlled circle had that opportunity. The house slaves who brought meals to Delilah's room had been chosen for their youth and their fear, girls barely in their teens who could be trusted to remain silent through terror of what might happen to them or their families if they spoke. Catherine made a single trip to Charleston that winter, appearing at her cousin's dinner with her padded belly prominent beneath an expensive silk dress. She endured the congratulations and advice of society matrons who had long pied her bareness. Playing her role with an actress's skill, she complained of the discomforts of pregnancy in tones that suggested she was secretly delighted by them, that these minor sufferings were the price of approaching motherhood. No one suspected that the child supposedly growing inside her was actually being carried by a slave woman locked in a room miles away. Spring arrived with its usual assault of heat and insects. Catherine retreated to the cottage she had built, taking Delilah with her and dismissing the regular house staff with vague explanations about needing complete rest during her final weeks. The cottage had been fitted with heavy curtains, its windows positioned to prevent anyone from seeing inside. It was attended by only 3 people: Catherine herself, an elderly enslaved woman named Patience, who served as midwife, and Delilah. The birth occurred on a Friday in late April, during an afternoon thunderstorm that sent a torrent of rain hammering against the cottage roof. Delilah labored for 14 hours, her screams muffled by thunder and the distance from the main house. Catherine remained present throughout, pacing the cottage's small parlor, occasionally going to the bedroom door to check on the progress. When the child finally emerged, a boy healthy and loud, Catherine moved with decisive speed. The baby was cleaned and wrapped by Patience, then immediately taken from Delilah's arms before the young mother could even hold him properly. Delilah was given laudanum for the pain and instructed to rest, her body still heavy with milk that would never feed her child. Catherine took the infant directly to the main house, where she staged an elaborate scene of exhaustion and triumph. Nathaniel was summoned to meet his newborn son. Servants were called to witness the blessed event, and messages were dispatched to Charleston, announcing the arrival of William Nathaniel Routledge, heir to one of the Low Country's finest plantations. The baby was, by all accounts, perfect for Catherine's purposes. His skin was fair, his features delicate and undefined, in the way of all newborns. When visitors came to offer their congratulations in the weeks that followed, they saw nothing to suggest the child was anything other than what Catherine claimed, the legitimate offspring of a respectable planter and his wife. Delilah remained in the cottage for 6 weeks, recovering from the birth in isolation. Her breasts became painfully engorged with milk meant for a child she would never nurse, then gradually dried up as her body adjusted to its loss. When she was finally returned to the main house, it was to a different role entirely, that of wet nurse to her own son, presented to the world as merely another slave woman paid to feed the master's child. This arrangement lasted only 3 months before Catherine deemed it too risky. The bond that might form between Delilah and the baby was too dangerous, the possibility of recognition too real. Instead, Catherine hired a wet nurse from a neighboring plantation, a woman with no knowledge of the circumstances surrounding William's birth. Delilah was reassigned to work in the cotton fields, removed from the main house entirely, and forbidden from coming within sight of the child she had borne. The deception, it seemed, was complete. The years that followed William's birth settled into a pattern of careful maintenance and constant vigilance. Catherine proved herself a devoted mother by every measure that Charleston society valued. She was attentive without being indulgent, educational without being pedantic, proud without being boastful. She dressed William in the finest clothes available, hired tutors to instruct him in Latin and Greek, ensured he learned to ride, shoot, and carry himself with the confidence expected of a planter's son. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect maternal arrangement ran a current of anxiety that never entirely subsided. Catherine watched the boy obsessively for any sign that might reveal his true parentage. She studied his features as they developed, comparing them constantly to Nathaniel's and to her own family's characteristics, searching for resemblances she could point to, if questions ever arose. William grew into a handsome child, his features refined and symmetrical. His skin remained fair, his hair a light brown that darkened slightly as he aged. To Catherine's relief, he showed no obvious signs of his mixed heritage, no particular curl to his hair, no breadth to his nose, no fullness to his lips that might prompt uncomfortable questions. He looked, in short, like what he was supposed to be: the son of 2 prominent white families carrying forward a lineage of wealth and respectability. Nathaniel, for his part, seemed to have buried the truth of William's origin so deeply in his consciousness that he rarely acknowledged it even to himself. He treated the boy with genuine affection, teaching him about cotton cultivation and estate management, introducing him to Charleston's commercial elite, preparing him to eventually assume control of the plantation. If Nathaniel ever felt guilt about the circumstances of William's conception and birth, he showed no outward sign of it. The enslaved community on the Rutledge plantation, however, remembered everything. Though no one dared speak openly about what had happened, the knowledge circulated in whispers and meaningful glances. The older slaves understood that Delilah had borne a child who now lived in the main house as white. They watched as the young woman was worked brutally in the fields, her hands blistering and callousing from labor she had never been trained for. Her previous education and refinement now counted as nothing. Delilah herself endured her changed circumstances with a kind of numb resignation that worried even those who cared for her. She had been promised special treatment for her cooperation, but Catherine had reneged on every implicit promise once the baby was safely claimed. Instead of being rewarded, Delilah had been punished, removed from the relative comfort of house service, and subjected to the grinding physical labor of field work. She was forbidden from speaking to anyone about the child, forbidden from even looking toward the main house when she worked in nearby fields. Her father, the cooper, grew gaunt with worry and rage. He understood what had been done to his daughter, understood that she had been used and then discarded. But he was powerless to help her or to seek any form of justice. The only thing he could do was try to make her life marginally more bearable, building her a more weatherproof cabin, ensuring she had sufficient food, protecting her from the worst impulses of the overseer who managed the field workers. As William grew from infant child to young boy, the contrast between his life and his mother's became increasingly stark. He played in manicured gardens while Delilah bent over cotton plants in burning sun. He learned to read from leather-bound books while she labored under the threat of the whip for any perceived slowness. He was taught that the enslaved people around him were a different order of being, inferior in every way, their suffering a natural and unremarkable fact of existence. The child and his birth oath existed in the same physical space, but in entirely different worlds, separated by a gulf that Catherine had engineered to be unbridgeable. The lies we tell ourselves to maintain power. This was the foundation of the entire plantation system, and Catherine had simply applied its logic to her own desperate situation. If you're finding this story as disturbing as it is fascinating, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think anyone in Charleston suspected the truth? Let us know what you think, and let's continue with what happened as William approached his 12th birthday. By 1856, William Rutledge had grown into a boy who showed every promise of becoming a respected gentleman. At 11 years old, he was tall for his age, quick-minded, and possessed of the easy confidence that comes from never having been denied anything of importance. He excelled in his studies, showed an aptitude for mathematics that pleased his father, and demonstrated the kind of casual command over the enslaved people around him that suggested he would manage the plantation effectively when the time came. It was in the summer of that year that the first crack appeared in Catherine's carefully constructed deception. William had developed a habit of wandering the plantation in the early mornings before the heat became oppressive and before his tutors arrived to begin the day's lessons. He was curious about the workings of the estate in a way that delighted Nathaniel, who saw in these early morning expeditions a sign that his son would be a hands-on manager rather than an absentee landlord. On one such morning in June, William made his way to the cooper's shop, drawn by the rhythmic sound of hammering and the rich smell of worked wood. Delilah's father, known to everyone simply as Isaac, was already at work, shaping staves for the barrels used to transport cotton to market. He was in his 50s now, his hands gnarled from decades of labor, but still capable of producing the finest cooperage in the Low Country. William had visited the shop many times before, fascinated by the craft and by Isaac's quiet competence. The old man had always been courteous but reserved, answering the boy's questions without elaboration, maintaining the careful distance required between enslaved and free in every interaction. But on this particular morning, something was different. William noticed that Isaac kept glancing at him with an expression the boy couldn't quite identify, not the usual weariness or difference, but something else, something that looked almost like pain. "Do you have children, Isaac?" William asked, with the thoughtless cruelty of a child who doesn't understand that enslaved people's families can be sold apart at any moment. Isaac's hand stilled on the wood he was shaping. For a long moment he said nothing, and William began to feel uncomfortable in the silence. "Had a daughter," Isaac finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "Still do, I suppose. She works the lower fields now. "Why doesn't she work here in the main house?" William asked. "My mother always says the house slaves are better off than the field hands." Isaac's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your mother has her reasons for everything she does, Master William." There was something in the way he said it, some subtle emphasis that the boy couldn't quite interpret, but that lodged in his mind like a splinter. William wanted to ask more, but Isaac had already returned to his work. The conversation clearly ended. That brief exchange might have faded from William's memory entirely had not another incident occurred just 2 weeks later. Catherine had taken to keeping a journal, a leather-bound volume in which she recorded household expenses, social engagements, and her private thoughts. She kept it locked in a small desk in her private sitting room, a space William had been taught to respect as off-limits. But on a humid afternoon, when Catherine was visiting neighbors and Nathaniel was in Charleston on business, William's curiosity overcame his training. The desk lock was flimsy, designed more for privacy than security. William had watched his mother open it countless times and understood the mechanism. Within moments, he had the drawer open and the journal in his hands. Most of what he found was mundane: records of linens purchased, notes about which families to invite to dinner, complaints about the difficulty of finding good help. But as he paged through entries from years past, he came across a section that made him stop breathing. The entries were from 1844 and early 1845, written in Catherine's precise handwriting, but with a tone of anxiety that was absent from her more recent writings. She wrote about physicians and treatments, about desperation and failed hopes. She wrote about her fear of losing everything if she couldn't produce an heir. And then, in an entry dated August 1844, she wrote something that William read 3 times before his brain could fully process the words. "I have conceived a solution to our desperate situation. It is bold beyond anything I might have imagined myself capable of, and it requires Nathaniel's cooperation in an act that society would condemn. But what choice do we have? I have identified a suitable candidate among the house servants, young, healthy, light enough that the result should pass scrutiny. If Nathaniel agrees, we could have our heir within the year, and no one need ever know the circumstances of the child's origin." William's hands were shaking as he turned the page, but the next several entries had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges along the journal's binding. The entries resumed months later in April 1845 with a single line: "William Nathaniel Routledge was born today, the answer to all our prayers." The boy sat frozen, the journal open on his lap, his mind refusing to accept what the words clearly implied. His mother had written about finding a suitable candidate among the house servants and obtaining an heir within the year. She had written about a child whose circumstances of origin no one should know. He was 11 years old enough to understand the basic facts of where babies came from, old enough to know that a woman couldn't be barren one year and suddenly pregnant the next, without something unusual having occurred. Old enough to understand on some level what his mother's careful words were really describing. William returned the journal to the desk, his hands numb and clumsy as he reset the lock. He walked out of the sitting room and through the house like a ghost, past servants who greeted him and received no response. He made his way outside and stood in the blazing afternoon sun, feeling cold despite the heat. The knowledge sat inside him like a stone, too large to ignore, but too frightening to examine directly. For several days, William moved through his regular routines in a kind of daze, responding to questions without really hearing them, completing his lessons without retaining anything he'd learned. Catherine noticed his distraction, but attributed it to the oppressive summer heat and the boredom that came with being confined to the plantation's routine. Nathaniel was less observant, preoccupied with news from Charleston, about increasing tensions between North and South, about abolitionists and states' rights, and all the political turmoil that seemed to be building toward some kind of crisis. William found himself studying his parents with new eyes, searching for signs of the deception his mother's journal had revealed. He noticed how Catherine sometimes looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite maternal affection, something more complex, tinged with anxiety and calculation. He noticed how Nathaniel's pride in him seemed slightly performative, as if his father was trying to convince himself of something, and he found himself thinking about Isaac's daughter, the woman who worked in the lower fields and never came near the main house. He tried to remember if he had ever seen her, but the field workers were largely invisible to him, a mass of dark figures laboring in the distance, individuals only when they were called forward for some specific purpose. The question nared at him: who was the suitable candidate his mother had written about, and what had happened to her after she had provided the heir Catherine so desperately needed? William knew he should leave the matter alone, knew that nothing good could come from digging deeper into whatever secret his mother's journal had hinted at. But he was 11 years old, and curiosity at that age is an almost physical force, impossible to resist, even when wisdom would counsel otherwise. He began paying attention to the enslaved women who worked around the plantation, particularly those who seemed to be near his mother's age. He started asking casual questions of the house servants who had worked in the main house 12 years ago, who had been moved to field work. Were there any women who used to be ladies' maids but weren't anymore? The responses he received were universally evasive. Slaves learned early and thoroughly that curiosity from white people, even white children, could be dangerous. They deflected his questions with non-answers, claimed not to remember, suggested he ask his mother if he wanted to know about household affairs from years past. But their very evasiveness told William he was onto something real. If there was nothing to hide, why would everyone seem so uncomfortable with his simple questions? His inquiries eventually reached Catherine's ears through the invisible network of information that connected the main house to the quarters. One of the house servants, a young woman named Chloe, mentioned to another slave that Master William had been asking strange questions about who used to work in the house. That slave told another, and within a day, Catherine had heard about her son's unexpected interest in the household's history. That evening, she summoned William to the parlor for what she called a conversation about appropriate behavior. Catherine sat in her favorite chair, her posture perfect, her expression composed but cool. William stood before her, feeling like a defendant awaiting judgment. "I've been told you've been questioning the servants about household matters from years past," Catherine said, her voice level, but with an edge beneath the surface. "May I ask what prompted this unusual interest?" William felt his face grow hot. He was a poor liar, had never needed to develop the skill, and his mother had always been able to read him easily. "I was just curious." He managed to say about how the plantation used to work before I was born. "Curiosity is an admirable trait," Catherine said, "when it's directed toward appropriate subjects. But the private affairs of this household are not appropriate topics for interrogating our servants. If you have questions about our family or our history, you should bring them to your father or to me. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," William said. But his voice was weak. Catherine studied him for a long moment, and William had the uncomfortable sensation that she could see straight through to the guilty knowledge hiding behind his eyes. When she finally spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, but there was still beneath the gentleness. "You're growing up, William, and with that comes certain responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is maintaining the dignity and privacy of our family. There are things that are not discussed, not questioned, not examined too closely, not because they're shameful, but because they're private. A gentleman learns to respect those boundaries. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" William understood perfectly. His mother was telling him to stop asking questions, to stop searching for answers about the meaning of those journal entries. She was telling him that some truths were meant to remain hidden, even or especially from those most affected by them. "I understand," he said, and this time he meant it. Catherine smiled, a warm expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good. Now run along to your lessons. And William, we won't need to have this conversation again, will we?" "No, ma'am." But as William left the parlor, he knew that his mother's warning had accomplished the opposite of its intended effect. By telling him not to investigate, Catherine had essentially confirmed that there was something worth investigating. The stone of knowledge inside him had just grown heavier, more impossible to ignore. Just when we thought the secret was safely buried, William's curiosity threatened to unearth everything his mother had worked so hard to hide. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when William finally learns the truth about his birth. The revelation came not through William's investigation, but through simple, terrible chance. It was late August, and a fever had spread through the slave quarters. The kind of summer sickness that came with the heat and the mosquitoes, leaving people weak and delirious. Most recovered within a few days, but some didn't. Isaac, Delilah's father, was one of the unlucky ones. By the time the overseer bothered to inform Nathaniel that the cooper was seriously ill, Isaac had been suffering for nearly a week. Nathaniel sent for a physician, not out of compassion, but out of economic calculation. As Isaac's skills were valuable and difficult to replace, the doctor, a heavy-set man named Reeves, who handled both white patients and the occasional enslaved person deemed worth the expense, examined Isaac in his cabin and pronounced his condition serious, but not necessarily fatal. He left medicine and instructions, then departed, leaving Isaac in Delilah's care. Delilah had been granted permission to tend to her father during his illness, a small mercy that was really just practical necessity. Someone needed to nurse him, and she was the obvious choice. She moved into his cabin, sleeping on the floor beside his bed, spooning water and thin broth into his mouth when he could swallow, bathing him with cool water when the fever raged. William had been observing these developments from a distance, his curiosity about Isaac's daughter intensifying now that he knew she was somewhere on the plantation. He had learned her name, Delilah, from casual questions that he tried to make sound innocent. He had learned that she was 22 when he was born, which would make her 34 now. He had learned that she had once worked in the main house, but had been reassigned to field work around the time of his birth. The pieces were all there, arranged in a pattern too obvious to ignore once you knew to look for it. On the third night of Isaac's illness, William found himself unable to sleep. The heat was oppressive, making the sheets cling to his skin like damp cloth. He rose from his bed and dressed quietly, then slipped out of the house into the thick August darkness. He told himself he was just walking, just seeking relief from the stifling air of his room, but his feet carried him toward the slave quarters with a purpose he didn't want to acknowledge. The quarters were quiet at this hour, most of the enslaved people already asleep in preparation for another day of labor that would begin before dawn. A few cabins showed the flicker of candlelight through cracks in the walls, but most were dark and still. Isaac's cabin was one of those showing light. William approached it slowly, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. He could hear voices inside, a man's weak rasp and a woman's soft responses. He moved closer to the window, which was open to catch any breath of air, and pressed himself against the rough wood of the cabin's exterior wall. Isaac's voice reached him first, barely audible. "You got to promise me something." "Promise? Anything, Papa," came the woman's reply, and William recognized the distinctive timbre, slightly hoarse, as if from years of calling out across cotton fields. "That boy, the one at the big house. You gotta tell him the truth someday. Not now. Lord knows. Not now. It would only bring trouble down on all of us. But someday, when the time's right, when he's old enough to understand and maybe do something with the knowledge, you promise me." There was a pause, then the sound of movement as if someone had pulled away sharply. "Papa, I can't. You know I can't. Mistress Catherine, would I know what she'd do?" Isaac interrupted, his voice gaining a terrible strength despite his illness. "I know all of it. I was there, wasn't I? I saw what they did to you. I saw how they locked you away like some animal. Saw how they took that baby from your arms before you could even hold him proper. I saw how they threw you out to the fields after, like you were nothing, like you hadn't just given them everything. That boy deserves to know where he came from, and you deserve for him to know you're his mama, not that woman who's stolen from you." William's legs began to shake. The world around him seemed to contract and expand simultaneously, his vision tunneling as his mind tried to reject what his ears were clearly hearing. "Promise me, Lily," Isaac continued, using what must have been a childhood nickname. "Promise me you'll find a way when the time comes. I'm dying. Don't shake your head at me, girl. We both know it's true, and I won't go to my grave knowing you'll carry this alone for the rest of your life. Promise me." The woman's voice broke on a sob. "I promise, Papa. I promise I'll tell him someday when it's safe." "It'll never be safe," Isaac said, and there was a terrible wisdom in his words. "But maybe someday it'll be possible. That's all I'm asking for, just possible." William stood frozen outside the cabin, every muscle locked, his breath coming in shallow gasps that he was desperately trying to quiet. The truth he had been circling around, the suspicion that had been growing since he'd read his mother's journal, was now confirmed, beyond any possibility of doubt. The woman inside that cabin, Delilah, Isaac's daughter, the field hand he had never properly looked at in all his 11 years, was his mother, his real mother. The woman who had actually carried him, birthed him, held him for however brief a moment before Catherine tore him away and claimed him as her own. He thought about Catherine's padded belly, about the convenient retreat to the cottage, about all the careful arrangements that had kept him ignorant of his own origins. He thought about how many people must have known. All the slaves, certainly, probably some of the white neighbors who had chosen to remain silent out of solidarity with Catherine's deception, or simple unwillingness to acknowledge such a profound violation of the racial order. Inside the cabin, Isaac's breathing had grown labored, and Delilah was murmuring comfort to him, her voice thick with tears. William knew he should leave, should return to the main house and pretend this night had never happened, should let Isaac die with his secret still nominally protected by silence. But he couldn't move. Some force stronger than self-preservation or social conditioning kept him rooted to that spot, listening to the sounds of grief and illness filtering through the cabin's thin walls. Finally, After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, William pushed himself away from the wall and moved toward the cabin door. His hand was shaking as he reached for the rough wooden handle. He had no plan, no idea what he would say or do once he crossed that threshold. He only knew that he had to see her, had to look at the woman who had given him life, and then been forced to watch him grow up as someone else's son. The door swung open with a creak that seemed impossibly loud in the night silence. Delilah's head snapped up from where she sat beside her father's bed, her face still wet with tears, her eyes widening in shock, and then fear as she recognized who stood in the doorway. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The woman who had borne him and the child who had been stolen from her, separated by 12 years and a gulf of circumstance that seemed unbridgeable. William saw her properly for the first time in his life. She was thin, worn down by years of field labor, her hands calloused and scarred, her clothing the rough homespun that marked her status. But her face showed the refinement that came from having once been educated, from having once been groomed for house service, and in her features he could see echoes of his own. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way her forehead creased when she was distressed. "Is it true?" The words came out of him unbidden, cracking in the middle like his voice was breaking all over again. "Are you my mother?" Delilah's face went through a rapid series of expressions, shock giving way to fear. Fear to something like resignation. Resignation to a grief so profound it seemed to age her before his eyes. She glanced at her father, whose eyes had opened at the sound of William's voice, then back at the boy standing in her doorway. She could have denied it. She could have claimed he had misheard, could have sent him away with some excuse that maintained the fiction Catherine had constructed. But looking at his face, seeing the knowledge already there in his eyes, she understood that denial would be both useless and cruel. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I am." The world tilted. William grabbed the doorframe to steady himself, his knuckles going white with the pressure. He felt like he was falling, even though his feet were firmly planted on the cabin's dirt floor. "Tell me," he said, and it was both a command and a plea. "Tell me everything. I want to know how. I need to understand." Delilah looked at Isaac again, seeking guidance, permission, something to help her navigate this moment she had both dreaded and yearned for since the day William was taken from her arms. Isaac gave a barely perceptible nod, his breathing shallow but steady. "Come inside and close the door." Delilah said quietly, "This isn't a story for the open air." William stepped into the cabin and pulled the door shut behind him. The space was tiny, barely large enough for Isaac's bed, a small table, and a couple of rough chairs. It smelled of sickness and sweat, and the herbs Delilah had been using to try to break her father's fever. A single candle provided the only light, casting long shadows that made everything seem unreal, dreamlike. Delilah gestured to one of the chairs, and William sat, his legs finally giving out completely. She remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her body together through sheer force of will, and then she began to speak. She told him about Catherine's desperation, about the years of failed treatments and growing panic. She told him about being summoned to Catherine's sitting room one evening and told that she had been chosen for a great honor, that she would help secure the Routledge family's future. She told him how she hadn't understood at first what Catherine was proposing, and how the understanding when it came had been like a physical blow. "I was 22 years old," Delilah said, her voice taking on a flat, recitative quality, as if she was describing events that had happened to someone else. "I'd been educated to read and write by my previous owner, a man your grandparents bought me from when I was 15. I thought that education made me valuable. Thought it meant I'd always work in the house, have an easier life than the field hands. I didn't understand that it just made me useful in a different way." She told him about the 3 nights Nathaniel had come to her room, how he had never spoken beyond Ter's instructions, how he had treated the act of creating William like a distasteful chore that needed to be completed as efficiently as possible. "He never looked at my face," Delilah said, and there was no emotion in her voice now, just a terrible blankness. "Not once. I don't think he wanted to see me as human. It would have made what he was doing harder, I suppose." William felt sick, bile rising in his throat as he understood the full mechanics of his own conception. This wasn't some distant historical fact he was learning about. This was his origin, the violence and violation that had brought him into existence. Delilah continued, describing the months of being kept isolated, hidden away. While Catherine paraded around Charleston with her padded belly, she described the loneliness of that time, the fear, the growing connection she felt with the child developing inside her, even as she knew it would be taken away. "I used to talk to you," she said. And now there was emotion in her voice, a raw tenderness that made William's chest ache. When I was alone in that room, I'd put my hands on my belly and tell you stories. I'd sing you songs my own mama sang to me before she died. I'd make promises about all the things I'd teach you, all the love I'd give you. I knew they were lies, knew you'd never really be mine. But I couldn't help myself. You were real to me, in a way you could never be to Mistress Catherine, no matter how much she wanted you. She described the birth, the hours of labor in the isolated cottage with only old patients for help, and Catherine pacing in the next room like an expectant father. She described the moment William finally emerged, the overwhelming relief that he was healthy, the desperate need she felt to hold him, to look at his face, to count his fingers and toes and memorize every detail. They let me hold you for maybe 2 minutes, Delilah said, tears streaming down her face now. Mistress Catherine took you from my arms before I could even finish looking at you. You were crying, you wanted a nurse. You were hungry, and she just took you and left. I could hear you crying as she carried you away, and then I couldn't hear you anymore, and I thought I would die from the pain of it. I wanted to die. I prayed to die. But she hadn't died. She had been kept in the cottage for 6 weeks, recovering from the birth, while her breast swelled painfully with milk meant for a baby she wasn't allowed to feed. Then she had been brought back to the main house, assigned briefly as William's wet nurse in a piece of cruelty so perfect it seemed almost designed to maximize her suffering. I fed you for 3 months, Delilah said softly. I held you in my arms and gave you my milk and looked at your face and couldn't say a word about what you were to me. I used to sing to you while you nursed, the same songs I'd sung when you were still inside me. I don't know if you remember. I hope you don't. It would hurt too much if you did. Then came the abrupt reassignment to fieldwork, the brutal transition from house slave to the hardest labor the plantation had to offer. Delilah had been 23 years old, educated, skilled in the refined tasks of a lady's maid, and suddenly she was expected to pick cotton from dawn to dusk, her hands blistering and bleeding as she learned work she had never been trained for. Why? William asked, the first word he'd spoken since she began her story. Why did they treat you like that, if they needed you too, if you'd given them what they wanted? Because I was dangerous, Delilah said simply. Every time I looked at you, every time I was near you, there was a chance someone would see something in my face, some tenderness or claim that would give away the truth. Mistress Catherine couldn't risk that, so she sent me away, put me where I couldn't see you, couldn't accidentally reveal what I knew, and she made sure everyone understood that if I ever spoke about what had happened, if I ever tried to claim you or tell you the truth, I'd be sold away or worse. William thought about all the times he had walked past the field hands, barely registering them as individuals. He thought about the possibility that his mother had been among them, watching him grow up from a distance, forbidden from acknowledging him or speaking to him or claiming any connection to the boy she had birthed. Have you? He started, then had to stop and swallow against the tightness in his throat. Have you been watching me all these years? Delilah nodded slowly. Every chance I got. When the field hands came back from work, I'd look for you in the windows of the big house. When we were allowed to go to church on Sundays, I'd watch you sitting in the white section with your parents with the rootages. I memorized your face at every age. I watched you learn to walk, learn to ride, learn to carry yourself like a young master. I watched you become someone I could never reach, could never claim son, and it killed me a little bit more every single day. The rawness of her pain was almost unbearable. William found himself crying without having realized he'd started, tears streaming down his face as he confronted the full horror of what had been done. Not just to him, but to this woman who had given him life and then been forced to live as a ghost in his world. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate, but the only ones he had. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have. I didn't know what I should have done, but I'm sorry. Delilah crossed the small space between them and knelt in front of his chair, taking his hands in hers. Her hands were rough, scarred from years of cotton and sun, but her grip was gentle. You were a child, she said firmly. You are a child. None of this is your fault. You didn't choose how you came into this world. You didn't choose to be raised as white. You didn't choose any of it. But what am I? William asked desperately. What am I supposed to be if you're my mother? He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say the word that would name what he was according to the laws and customs of South Carolina. You're my son, Delilah said, squeezing his hands. That's all that matters to me. You're my son, and I have loved you every day of your life. Even when I couldn't say it, even when I couldn't show it, even when you didn't know I existed, I have loved you with everything I am." Behind them, Isaac made a sound, half cough, half sob. "That's right, boy," the old man rasped. "You're my grandson. Got my mother's eyes if you want to know the truth. She was Gula from down on the islands. You got her way of looking at things like you're seeing more than what's right in front of you." William turned to look at Isaac, seeing him with new eyes. This man was his grandfather. This Diane Koopa was his family more truly than Catherine or Nathaniel ever had been. "Does everyone know?" William asked, turning back to Delilah. "All the slaves. Do they all know who I really am?" "Yes," Delilah said quietly. "They've always known. Secrets like this don't stay secret among us. We see everything, hear everything. We have to survive. But no one would ever speak of it to white folks. It would be signing their death warrant." William felt the weight of that knowledge settle on him. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people walking around with the truth of his origins forced into conspiracy by their powerlessness. Every slave who had bowed to him, every yes, Master William, and no, Master William had been delivered by someone who knew he was actually one of them, stolen and raised as something he wasn't. "What do I do now?" he asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. "How am I supposed to? I can't pretend. I don't know this. I can't go back to how things were, but I don't know what else to do." Delilah's face showed the complexity of emotions warring inside her. She wanted to tell him to claim his true identity, to reject the lie of his whiteness, to acknowledge her as his mother. But she also understood the impossibility of that, the danger it would put him in, the way it would destroy not just his life, but potentially hers as well if he made the wrong move. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "I've thought about this moment for 12 years, imagined 1,000 different ways it might happen, but I never knew what I'd tell you when it did. The world you live in and the world I live in, they're not meant to overlap. You crossing that line wouldn't make you free in my world, it would just make you enslaved like me. And I can't wish that on you, no matter how much I want to claim you." "But you are claiming me," William said. "Right now, you're telling me the truth. That means something. It means I'm a selfish woman who couldn't keep silent when given the chance to speak," Delilah said, but there was a small, sad smile on her face. "It means I'm weak enough to want you to know where you came from, even if that knowledge only brings you pain." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had been said pressing down on them. Outside, a rooster crowed prematurely, confused by the approaching dawn. Soon it would be morning and William would have to return to the main house and the moment of connection between mother and son would end. "Can I?" William started, then stopped, unsure how to ask what he wanted to ask. "Can I come back to see you again to talk to you?" Delilah's expression showed the war between desire and caution. "It's dangerous," she said. "If Mistress Catherine finds out, if she suspects we've spoken." "I don't care," William said. And he was surprised to find he meant it. "I don't care about the danger. You're my mother. I want to know you." "Then come," Delilah said softly. "Come when you can, when it's safe. But be careful. The consequences of this truth coming out, they'd be terrible for both of us." William nodded, understanding. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady, and moved toward the door. But before he left, he turned back one more time. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me, for not lying to me, even though it would have been safer." "You deserve the truth," Delilah said. "You've always deserved the truth." William slipped out of the cabin into the pre-dawn darkness, his mind reeling, his entire sense of self shattered and reforming into something he didn't yet understand. He walked back toward the main house like a stranger in his own life, seeing everything with new eyes, the slave quarters that housed people who shared his blood, the cotton fields his mother worked in brutal heat, the grand calms of the house built on wealth extracted from the labor of people who were his people. Whether white society would acknowledge it or not, by the time he reached his room and crawled back into bed, the sun was beginning to rise. He lay there staring at the ceiling, knowing that sleep was impossible, knowing that everything had changed in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The boy who had walked out of the house last night was gone. The person who had returned was someone different entirely, someone who knew the truth about where he came from and could never unknow it, someone who would have to decide every day what to do with that knowledge. The days immediately following that night in Isaac's cabin were the hardest of William's young life. He moved through his regular routines like an actor playing a role, saying his lines and hitting his marks while his mind churned with the implications of what he had learned. Isaac died 3 days after William's visit, his weakened body finally succumbing to the fever. Delilah was given a few hours to prepare his body for burial, then was sent immediately back to the fields, her brief reprieve from labor over now that her father no longer needed her care. William watched the funeral from a distance, a simple affair in the slave cemetery conducted by one of the older enslaved men who served as preacher for the community. He wanted to attend, wanted to stand beside Delilah and acknowledge Isaac as his grandfather. But he understood that such an action would raise questions he couldn't answer without destroying everything. So he stayed away and mourned privately, grieving not just for Isaac, but for all the relationships he had been denied, all the connection that had been stolen from him by Catherine's scheme. Catherine, meanwhile, was watching William with increasing concern. She had noticed the change in him, the way he seemed distracted and troubled, the way he looked at her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. She cornered him one afternoon in the library, closing the door behind her to ensure privacy. "William, I need you to be honest with me," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Something has changed. Something is troubling you, and I need to know what it is." William looked at her. This woman who had raised him, taught him his letters, comforted him through childhood illnesses, claimed him as her own, and felt a complex mixture of emotions that he couldn't begin to articulate. Love? Yes, because she had been his mother in every practical sense for 11 years, but also betrayal, anger, a profound sense of violation at the lie she had built his entire existence around. "I've been thinking about Isaac," he said, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth, about how he died, about how Delilah lost her father. Catherine's face showed carefully controlled relief. "That's very sensitive of you," she said. "It's good that you have compassion for the slaves, but you mustn't let it trouble you too deeply. Death is part of life, and Isaac lived a long, useful existence." The casual dismissal of Isaac's humanity, the reduction of his life to usefulness, made William's stomach turn, but he kept his face neutral, nodded as if accepting her wisdom. "You're right, of course," he said, and watched Catherine relax slightly. "Good boy," she said, touching his cheek with the same gesture of affection she had used throughout his childhood. "I know you have a tender heart. It's one of the things I love about you. But you must learn to maintain proper distance. These people, they're not like us. They don't feel things the same way we do." William wanted to scream at her that these people included his actual mother, that they felt things exactly as deeply as white people did, that her entire worldview was built on a lie so profound it had deformed her basic humanity. But he said nothing, just nodded again and let her believe she had successfully addressed whatever had been troubling him. After that conversation, William became more careful about concealing his inner turmoil. He resumed his studies with apparent enthusiasm, participated in the state management with his father, played the role of beautiful son, and future planter with skill that would have made Catherine proud if she'd known it was a performance. But in the early mornings and late evenings, when he could move around the plantation without attracting attention, William sought out Delilah. These meetings were brief, conducted in shadows and silence, always with the risk of discovery hanging over them. They talked about her life before his birth, about the world of the slave quarters that he had never seen, about the brutal realities of the system that had created and sustained his comfortable existence. Delilah taught him things no white child was meant to know. She taught him about the networks of resistance that ran through the enslaved community, the stolen moments of joy and connection that made survival possible, the dreams of freedom that people whispered about in the night. She taught him that the people he had been raised to see as property were in fact fully human, as intelligent, as emotional, as worthy of dignity as anyone in Charleston society. And she taught him about himself, about the blood that ran in his veins, about the heritage he carried that Catherine had tried so hard to erase. "Your great-grandmother was brought from Africa," Delilah told him one night, her voice soft with memory. "My grandmother, she spoke a language none of us ever learned, used to sing songs and words we couldn't understand. My father said she never forgot her homeland, used to tell stories about the village she was stolen from. That's your blood too, William, not just the white planter family's mistress Catherine likes to boast about. You carry Africa in you whether the world acknowledges it or not." These revelations were both painful and liberating. William began to understand that identity wasn't just about what others told you were. It was about what you knew yourself to be, what you chose to acknowledge, what you refused to deny, even when denial would be easier. But knowing the truth and being able to act on it were two very different things. William was still legally white, still the recognized heir to the Rootley plantation, still expected to take his place among Charleston's elite, and Delilah was still enslaved, still subject to being sold or punished or killed at the whim of the very people William called parents. As months passed, and William's 12th birthday approached, he began to grapple with an impossible question. What was he supposed to do with the knowledge of his true origins? He considered briefly the idea of exposing the truth publicly, of standing up in church or at some social gathering and announcing that he was the son of an enslaved woman, that his entire identity was a fraud constructed by his mother's desperation and his father's complicity. But he understood that such a revelation would accomplish nothing except his own destruction. He would be declared enslaved by law, his property would revert to Nathaniel, and he would be either sold away or kept on the plantation as a slave himself. Delilah would likely be sold as well, separated from him, and punished for having revealed the secret. And Catherine and Nathaniel would simply construct a new story, claim he had gone mad, find some way to protect themselves and their position. The truth, William realized with bitter clarity, had no power in a world built on lies. He considered running away, escaping to the north where slavery was illegal, where he might be able to live openly as a person of mixed race without facing immediate enslavement. But he was 12 years old with no money of his own, no knowledge of how to survive outside the protected world of the plantation, and running would mean abandoning Delilah, leaving her to face whatever consequences Catherine might impose for his disappearance. So William did what countless other people in impossible situations had done before him. He adapted. He learned to live with cognitive dissonance, to hold multiple truths in his mind simultaneously without letting them paralyze him. He was William Rutledge, son of Nathaniel and Catherine, heir to a cotton plantation, member of Charleston society. That was the truth the world saw and the identity that protected him from enslavement. But he was also William, son of Delilah, grandson of Isaac, carrier of African and European blood, a living contradiction of every principle the slave society was built upon. That was the truth he held privately, the identity he acknowledged in stolen moments with his birth odor. Both truths were real. Both identities were his, and the tension between them would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. As William grew into adolescence and then adulthood, he maintained his relationship with Delilah in secret, meeting with her when he could, learning from her, holding on to the connection that gave his life meaning beyond the empty rituals of planter society. When he went away to college in Charleston, he wrote her letters that had to be smuggled to her through trusted intermediaries. When he returned to manage the plantation after his education, he used his authority to make her life marginally better, assigning her to easier tasks as she aged, ensuring she had adequate food and shelter, protecting her from the worst excesses of the overseers. But he never publicly acknowledged her as his mother. He never challenged the system that enslaved her. When the time came, he married a white woman from a respectable family, had children who were raised as white, perpetuated the same lies and silences that had defined his own upbringing. He told himself he was being practical, that open rebellion would accomplish nothing except his own destruction and hers. He told himself he was doing what he could within the constraints of an unjust system. He told himself that preserving his position gave him the power to at least ameliorate some suffering, even if he couldn't end it. But in his private moments, in the dark hours before dawn, when sleep eluded him, William knew he was simply choosing comfort over truth, choosing security over justice, choosing to benefit from a system he knew to be evil, rather than sacrificing himself in futile opposition to it. Delilah never blamed him for these choices. She had lived too long in the reality of slavery to expect any different. She had learned early that survival meant accepting what couldn't be changed and finding joy in whatever small mercies were possible. The fact that her son knew who she was, that he visited her when he could, that he called her mother in private, even if he could never acknowledge her publicly. These things gave her a measure of peace that many enslaved mothers never received. She died in 1871 at the age of 49, her body worn out from decades of labor and the accumulated trauma of a life lived in bondage. William, by then 38 years old, attended her funeral, not as her son, not with any public display of grief, but standing at a distance, one white man among several who had come to mark the passing of a longtime plantation worker. But after the service, when the other white observers had left, William stayed. He stood beside the fresh grave as the sun set over the Carolina low country, and he let himself cry for the first time since he was 11 years old. He cried for Delilah, for Isaac, for the relationship he had been allowed to have with them only in fragments and shadows. He cried for the children he had fathered, who would never know their grandmother, who would grow up as white as he had, ignorant of half their heritage. And he cried for himself, for the boy who had learned a truth that changed everything and nothing, for the man who had chosen complicity over confrontation, for the son who had loved his mother but never been able to claim her. In his will, written in 1889 and filed after his death in 1892, William left a small bequest to the descendants of Isaac the Cooper in recognition of his long and faithful service to the Roodled family. It was the closest he could come to acknowledging the truth, a veiled reference that none of his white family members would understand, but that those who knew the real story might recognize as a final, insufficient gesture toward justice. The secret died with him, or so he believed. His children never learned the truth of their heritage. His grandchildren grew up secure in their whiteness, their place in society, their identity as descendants of one of South Carolina's old families. The story of Delilah and the child she had been forced to bear, then forbidden to claim, faded into the unmarked graves and forgotten corners of plantation history. But secrets, even buried ones, have a way of leaving traces in the careful genealogies kept by Black families, in the whispered stories passed down through generations, in the DNA that carries memory forward even when official records have been scrubbed clean. In all these places, the truth persisted. William Rutledge lived as a white man, died as a white man, was buried in the White Cemetery in Charleston with full honors. His obituary praised his skill as a planter, his service to the community, his devotion to his family. Not a word was said about where he really came from, about the mother who had loved him from a distance, about the terrible compromise at the heart of his existence. That silence was its own kind of monument, a testament to the power of lies when backed by law and custom. A reminder that injustice doesn't require monsters. Only ordinary people willing to accept comfort purchased through the suffering of others, only a system that allows theft to be called legitimate when the stolen are deemed unworthy of protection. The Rootlet Plantation stands today as a historic site. Its main house carefully preserved, its gardens maintained, its story told to tourists who come to marvel at antebellum elegance. There are plaques describing the family's history, the cotton economy, the architecture of the big house. There is nothing about Delilah, nothing about the theft of her child, nothing about the 12 years of secrecy and the lifetime of silence that followed, nothing about the complicated grief of a son who knew two truths and could claim only one. Some truths remain too uncomfortable for historic preservation, too damaging to the myth society tells itself about the past. So they're left out of the official story, relegated to footnotes, if acknowledged at all, allowed to fade into the background noise of history. But they don't stop being true just because they've been forgotten. They don't stop mattering just because they've been erased from the record. The horror of what happened to Delilah, the tragedy of William's stolen identity, the compromise that poisoned his entire existence. These things remain real, remain important, remain a reminder of what human beings will do to each other when systems of power make cruelty convenient and profit from injustice. William Rutledge was born into a lie, lived inside that lie, died having never fully escaped it, and in that sense, his story is the story of America itself, a nation built on theft and sustained by silence, a place where truth was too often sacrificed to comfort, where justice was deferred in favor of peace, where the dreams of freedom were always conditional on someone else's continued subjugation. The child taken from his mother's arms grew into a man who could never be whole, who carried the wound of his stolen identity until the day he died, and that wound multiplied across millions of people, across generations, across centuries, is the legacy we still live with today. The inheritance of a system that told some people they were worth everything and others that they were worth nothing and made everyone complicit in maintaining the distinction. This story reminds us that the most enduring horrors are those we choose to perpetuate through silence, those we maintain through complicity, those we pass down through generations of carefully maintained lies. What do you think of William's choices? Could he have done anything differently that would have made a real difference? How do you think the enslaved community viewed him? As one of them forced into an impossible position, or as a betrayer who chose comfort over truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more stories like this, historical mysteries that reveal the darkest corners of American history, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the unsettling truth behind the lies we tell ourselves. Until next time, remember, some families kept secrets far darker than anything they could admit, and those secrets shaped not just individual lives, but the entire fabric of American society.